March 2023. Detective Lisa Carmichael sat at her desk in the Troy Police Department, staring at the email on her screen. She read it once, twice, 3 times. Her hands started shaking. The DNA results from Othram Inc. had finally come back after 8 months of waiting. 8 months of hoping that a blood sample recovered from a 1978 crime scene, preserved for 45 years in a dusty evidence box, might finally yield answers through forensic genetic genealogy. But these weren't the kind of answers anyone expected. Not a drifter passing through Pike County decades ago. Not some faceless stranger from another state. Not an unknown predator who vanished into the night. Someone who lived here. Someone who'd been here all along. Someone she'd seen at the farmer's market just last weekend, selling tomatoes from his garden, smiling and making small talk about the weather. Her partner, Detective Raymond Tucker, leaned over her shoulder. "That can't be right. Run it again." But there was no mistake. The family tree built from public databases, birth certificates, and obituaries all pointed to the same person, a third-generation Pike County resident, a familiar face at the courthouse square, at Troy's annual Pioneer Days festival, at Sunday services at First Baptist Church. Someone who had watched this community mourn for 45 years while carrying an unimaginable secret. What began as a routine robbery on a humid June evening in 1978 was about to expose a truth that would shake Pike County to its foundation. This isn't just a story about a cold case finally solved. It's about how little we truly know about the people we think we know best. It's about a killer who hid in plain sight, maintaining lawns, attending church potlucks, and living what looked like an ordinary life, while families waited for answers that were right in front of them the entire time. Tonight, we'll walk through the brutal murder that changed Pike County forever, trace the decades of investigation failures that let a killer slip through the cracks, and reveal the shocking arrest that made everyone question their neighbors. This is a story about violence, secrets, persistence, and the moment when modern technology finally brought justice to a family that never stopped believing this day would come. By the end, you'll understand why Pike County residents locked their doors that night in March 2023, why churches held emergency prayer meetings, and why social media exploded with a single question. If it was him all along, who else might be hiding among us? Before we dive into this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Cold cases like this one need attention, and your support helps ensure these victims are never forgotten. The algorithm rewards engagement, so liking this video actually helps other people discover these important stories. And here's something I'm always curious about. Where are you watching from today? And what time is it there right now? Drop your location and the current time in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel and how they connect us across different cities, countries, and time zones. It reminds me that the search for justice is universal, no matter where we are. Now, let's go back to June 14th, 1978, a Wednesday evening in Troy, Alabama, a night that started like any other but ended with a murder that would haunt an entire community for nearly half a century. June 14th, 1978. The thermometer outside Henderson's pharmacy read 89 degrees at 7 o'clock in the evening, typical for a southeastern Alabama summer. Downtown Troy was winding down for the day. Shops were closing. Locals were heading home for supper. The streets were quiet except for the occasional car passing through the courthouse square. Bobby Ray Thompson stood behind the counter of Thompson's Hardware on Main Street, the same place he'd worked his entire adult life. At 54 years old, he'd taken over the family business from his father in 1963. He didn't just inherit a store, he inherited a reputation built over 3 generations. Thompson's Hardware sold everything from nails and lumber to fishing gear and garden supplies. The wooden floorboards creaked when you walked. The smell of machine oil mixed with fresh-cut rope greeted every customer. Every local knew this place. It was as familiar as home. Bobby Ray stood 5'11" with a stocky build from years of lifting heavy merchandise. His hands were calloused, his face weathered from loading trucks under the Alabama sun. He wore the same thing every day: khaki work pants, a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and steel-toed boots. His hair had gone mostly gray, but his eyes were sharp. He knew the price of every item in his store without checking tags. Those who knew Bobby Ray described him as steady. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Dorothy, in 1950. They had 2 sons, both grown and working in Montgomery. Bobby Ray coached Little League Baseball for 15 years. He served on the Pike County Chamber of Commerce. He kept a jar of penny candy by the register for kids who came in with their parents. On Sundays, he taught the men's Bible study class at Troy United Methodist Church. Bobby Ray was the kind of man you could set your watch by, recalled Margaret Willis, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down. He opened at 8 o'clock sharp, closed at 7, never a minute early or late. If you needed something after hours, you could call his house and he'd meet you at the store. That's just who he was. June 14th should have been no different. Bobby Ray had spent the day helping customers, stocking shelves, and preparing for a delivery scheduled for Thursday morning. His wife Dorothy had called at 5:30 to remind him they were having meatloaf for supper. He'd promised to be home by 7:30. At 6:45, 3 customers were still browsing. The Hendersons needed paint for their kitchen renovation. Carl Mitchell was looking at fishing lures for an early morning trip to Lake Troy, and Mrs. Patricia Simmons needed replacement hinges for her garden shed. All 3 would later tell police that Bobby Ray seemed in good spirits. He was joking with Carl about the catfish that always seemed to get away. He helped Mrs. Simmons find exactly the right size hinges. He mixed paint for the Hendersons while discussing the best technique for getting smooth coverage on old cabinets. By 6:58, all 3 customers had made their purchases and left. Patricia Simmons was the last one out the door. She waved goodbye and heard Bobby Ray call out, "See you next week, Pat." His voice was cheerful, easy, showing no sign of concern. Those would be the last words anyone heard Bobby Ray Thompson speak. What happened in the next 15 minutes would remain a mystery for 45 years. 7:14 p.m. 17-year-old Kevin Palmer was walking past Thompson's Hardware on his way home from his job at the Texaco station down the street. He noticed something odd. The front door was standing wide open. That was unusual because Bobby Ray always kept it closed to preserve the air conditioning. Alabama summers were brutal, and nobody wasted cool air. The lights were on inside, but Kevin couldn't see anyone behind the counter. Something just felt wrong, Kevin told investigators hours later. Bobby Ray never left that door open, never. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to decide what to do. That's when he heard it, a weird sound, kind of like gurgling. Kevin stepped inside. Bobby Ray Thompson lay behind the main counter in a pool of blood. His white shirt was soaked crimson. He'd been struck multiple times on the head with what investigators would later determine was a blunt object, possibly a hammer or heavy wrench. The cash register stood open, empty. The small lockbox where Bobby Ray kept larger bills had been pried open and cleaned out. His wallet was missing from his back pocket. Kevin ran. He burst into Henderson's pharmacy next door, screaming for someone to call an ambulance. Within minutes, Troy police arrived. By 7:28, Bobby Ray Thompson was pronounced dead at the scene by Dr. Gerald Foster, who'd been having dinner at Murphy's Diner 2 blocks away when the call came through. The news spread through Troy with the speed that only small-town tragedy can travel. By 8 o'clock, a crowd had gathered on Main Street, held back by yellow police tape. Neighbors clutched each other. Business owners stood in shocked silence. Children were ushered away from the scene. Dorothy Thompson arrived in her neighbor's car. She collapsed into the arms of the police chief when she learned her husband was gone. Her screams echoed down Main Street. People who were there that night say they'll never forget that sound. The sound of a woman's world shattering. Their sons were notified by state troopers in Montgomery. They arrived in Troy by midnight, walking into the house where meatloaf sat cold on the table, the meal their father never came home to eat. Bobby Ray Thompson, a man who'd never hurt anyone, a man who'd spent his life serving his community, fixing lawnmowers for elderly neighbors, giving credit to families going through hard times, teaching Sunday school to teenage boys who needed a father figure. Murdered in his own store for whatever cash was in that register. Maybe $200, maybe $300. The price of a life in Pike County on a Wednesday evening in June 1978. And somewhere out there, walking the same streets where people gathered to mourn, the killer breathed easy. Maybe went home to dinner. Maybe watched television. Maybe slept soundly while Dorothy Thompson wept through the night in a bed that would forever feel too empty. For 45 years, that killer would walk free. For 45 years, they would live among the people they'd traumatized. For 45 years, they would carry a secret that should have destroyed them, but instead became just another part of their carefully constructed life. But in March 2023, that secret would finally come crashing down. Pike County in 1978 had limited resources for major crime investigations. The Troy Police Department employed just 12 officers. Most had no experience handling homicide cases. Chief Walter Henderson had been on the force for 20 years, but had overseen only 2 previous murder investigations. Both were domestic disputes that resulted in quick arrests. This was different. This was a stranger killing, or at least, that's what investigators thought. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation was called in within hours, bringing forensic capabilities beyond local capacity. But even state resources in 1978 were primitive by modern standards. There was no DNA analysis, no computerized databases, no surveillance cameras capturing license plates or faces. Investigation relied on physical evidence collection, witness interviews, and good old-fashioned detective work. The crime scene told a brutal but straightforward story. Bobby Ray had been attacked from behind while standing at the register, likely preparing to close out the drawer for the night. The first blow stunned him. Subsequent strikes killed him. The killer had then opened the register, taken all visible cash, pried open the lockbox with a screwdriver or similar tool, and removed Bobby Ray's wallet before fleeing out the front door. Physical evidence was sparse. Investigators collected blood samples, fingerprints from the register and counter, and the screwdriver used to pry open the lockbox. The murder weapon wasn't found at the scene. That suggested the perpetrator brought it and took it with them. Planning. Premeditation. No witnesses reported seeing anyone fleeing the area around 7 o'clock, though downtown Troy was relatively quiet that time of evening. "We processed everything according to 1978 protocols," explained former ABI investigator Calvin Brooks in a 2022 interview. "But our capabilities were limited. We could type blood, lift fingerprints, interview witnesses. We couldn't analyze DNA, trace cell phone records, or review surveillance footage because those things didn't exist yet. The blood evidence was typed. A positive, matching Bobby Ray's blood type. But investigators also found several small drops near the back door that were B positive. That suggested the killer may have cut themselves during the attack or while prying open the lockbox. Blood typing in 1978 could narrow suspects but not identify individuals. Approximately 9% of the population has B positive blood. In Pike County alone, that meant potentially 2,500 people shared that blood type. Fingerprints lifted from the register and lockbox yielded no matches when compared against known criminals in state and federal databases. Either the killer wore gloves, wiped surfaces clean, or had no prior criminal record requiring fingerprinting. The investigation quickly focused on three primary avenues: robbery suspects with violent histories, individuals who had conflicts with Bobby Ray, and people who might have known about cash kept at the hardware store. Within 48 hours, detectives had interviewed over 50 people. They identified several persons of interest, though none emerged as a clear suspect. Michael Thornton, a 23-year-old drifter who'd been seen around Troy for about 2 weeks, was questioned extensively. He had no solid alibi for the evening of June 14th, but also no physical evidence linking him to the scene. After 3 days, he was released and left town. He was later confirmed to be in Mississippi by June 18th. Gerald Pruitt became another focus. He was a former employee fired by Bobby Ray 6 months earlier for repeated tardiness. Pruitt had B positive blood type and had made angry statements about Bobby Ray to friends after his termination. But 5 witnesses confirmed Pruitt was at a softball game in Brundage, 20 miles away, from 6:30 until after 9 o'clock on June 14th. His alibi held. The third person of interest was Russell Wayne Cooper, a 31-year-old local man with a criminal record, including 2 burglaries and 1 assault charge from 1974. Cooper had been seen near downtown Troy on the afternoon of June 14th and had no clear alibi for the evening. But fingerprints taken from Cooper didn't match those lifted from the crime scene. His blood type was O positive. Without physical evidence connecting him to Thompson's hardware, investigators couldn't build a case. As summer turned to fall, leads dried up. The physical evidence had been analyzed to the limits of 1978 technology. Witnesses had been interviewed and re-interviewed. Tips coming into the police department grew less frequent and less credible. By Christmas 1978, the investigation had effectively stalled. What time is it where you're watching right now? Let me know in the comments below. The Martinez family endured 45 years of changing seasons without answers. Through scorching Alabama summers, through crisp autumn evenings, through winter holidays marked by empty chairs, through spring days that brought renewal to everything except their hopes for resolution. Day or night, somewhere, families are still waiting for answers in cases just like this one. If you're invested in this story, make sure you hit that like button. It genuinely helps the algorithm push these videos to people who care about cold cases and victims who deserve justice. Now, as 1978 gave way to 1979, the Bobby Ray Thompson case officially remained open. But the truth was, it had gone cold. It was devastating, Dorothy Thompson told a reporter in 1995. Not just losing Bobby Ray, but knowing someone did this and walked free. Every time I went downtown, I wondered if I was passing the person who murdered my husband. Every face became suspect. Every smile seemed potentially fake. That's what unsolved murder does to you. It poisons everything. For the Thompson family, time stopped on June 14th, 1978. The kitchen calendar remained turned to that month for years, the day circled in red ink. A silent testament to the moment their world shattered. Bobby Ray's sons, Michael and David, both in their 20s when their father was killed, struggled to process their grief while watching their mother deteriorate under the weight of unanswered questions. Michael threw himself into work, rarely speaking about his father. David became obsessed with the case, calling detectives monthly for updates that never came. Dorothy attended every anniversary vigil. For 45 years, she showed up at the courthouse square on June 14th, holding a framed photograph of Bobby Ray and a candle that flickered in the summer breeze. Sometimes 20 people joined her, sometimes 5. Some years she stood alone. She never remarried, never moved from the house she'd shared with Bobby Ray. His clothes remained in the closet. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand. His favorite coffee mug stayed in the cabinet, unused but not discarded. "My grandmother never gave up believing someone would be held accountable," said Jennifer Thompson Reese, Bobby Ray's granddaughter, in 2023. "She kept every newspaper article, every police update, every anniversary memorial program. She made us promise we wouldn't let it be forgotten." When she died in 2019, her last words to my dad were, "Find out who killed your father." It became our family's mission. The extended family felt Bobby Ray's absence at every gathering, his empty chair at Thanksgiving, his missing face in Christmas photographs, grandchildren who never got to meet him, great-grandchildren who knew him only through stories and faded pictures. The case was reviewed multiple times over the decades. In 1985, when a similar hardware store robbery murder occurred in Dothan, detectives examined whether the crimes might be connected. They weren't. The Dothan case resulted in a quick arrest of a suspect with no connection to Pike County. By 1990, Chief Henderson had retired. New leadership brought fresh perspectives. The new chief, Raymond Tucker, made the Thompson case one of his priorities. He assigned a detective to review all existing evidence and conduct new interviews. This effort produced several new tips. One man claimed his deceased brother had confessed to the murder on his deathbed. Investigation revealed the brother had been in prison in Texas on June 14th, 1978. Another dead end. The advent of DNA analysis in criminal investigations sparked hope in 1994. Detective Margaret Lawson reviewed the physical evidence from 1978, identifying the B-positive blood samples found near the back door as the most promising material for testing. The samples were sent to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. The DNA extraction succeeded, producing a genetic profile of the unknown subject. But with no suspect to compare it against, the profile simply became another piece of evidence waiting for context. CODIS, the National DNA Database, wasn't fully operational until 1998. Even then, it contained only convicted offenders' profiles. If the killer had no DNA on file, there would be no match. Year after year, the answer was the same: no match found. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Pike County transformed dramatically. Troy expanded as housing developments sprouted where farmland once stood. The university grew, bringing diversity and economic activity. Chain stores replaced many locally owned businesses. Thompson's Hardware closed in 1985, unable to continue without Bobby Ray. Dorothy couldn't bear to run it. The sons had their own careers in Montgomery. The building went through several incarnations: an antique store, a consignment shop, briefly a yoga studio. Eventually, it was converted to office space. Every transformation felt like another piece of Bobby Ray being erased, another connection to that night being paved over or painted white. But the memory never faded. Parents still use Bobby Ray's murder as a cautionary tale about locking doors. True crime enthusiasts researched it endlessly, theorizing on internet forums about who might have done it. And the Thompson family waited. Dorothy grew older. Her hair went white. Her hands developed arthritis. Her hearing faded. But her determination never wavered. She attended vigils until her health wouldn't allow it. She called the police department until she physically couldn't dial the phone anymore. She died in January 2019, 4 years before the breakthrough would come. She was 89 years old. Her obituary listed her surviving children and grandchildren, but noted she was preceded in death by her beloved husband Bobby Ray, taken far too soon. At her funeral, Jennifer Reese placed Bobby Ray's photograph in Dorothy's casket. "So they could be together again," she explained. "Grandma waited long enough." 4 years later, in that same funeral home, the Thompson family would gather again. Not for a funeral, but for a press conference announcing the arrest that Dorothy had died, believing she'd never see. Looking back, the question everyone asks is, how did the killer slip through the cracks? The answer reveals both the limitations of 1970s investigative techniques and critical mistakes made during the original investigation. Vernon Dale Pritchett had been interviewed on June 16, 1978, 2 days after the murder. He'd worked part-time at Thompson's Hardware during the summer of 1977. He'd known Bobby Ray. He'd been inside that store hundreds of times. In the interview transcript, preserved in the case file, Vernon expressed shock and sadness. He said Bobby Ray had been good to him. When asked about his whereabouts on June 14th, Vernon stated he'd been home alone that evening because his wife Linda was visiting her mother in Dothan. No one verified this alibi in detail. Vernon wasn't considered a serious suspect. He was 23 years old, had no criminal record, and had worked for Bobby Ray. The relationship seemed positive. Investigators focused on more obvious suspects: the drifter, the fired employee with the grudge, the man with a criminal history. This was tunnel vision in action, the tendency to pursue the most likely seeming leads while overlooking quieter possibilities. Former Detective Calvin Brooks admitted in 2022, "We made assumptions based on limited information. Vernon seemed like a good kid. Bobby Ray had even written him a letter of recommendation for a job at Blackwell Industries. Why would he kill someone who helped him? We were looking for someone with motive, an enemy, a desperate criminal. We didn't consider that the motive might be as simple as money and opportunity." The interview with Vernon lasted less than 30 minutes. His emotional response seemed genuine. His explanation seemed plausible. And frankly, investigators were overwhelmed with tips and leads. They moved on. This wasn't malicious negligence. It was the reality of small-town policing in 1978, with limited resources and limited experience with complex homicide investigations. But there were other failures too. The B-positive blood found near the back door should have been a bigger focus. Every person of interest should have been blood typed and compared. Vernon Pritchett had B-positive blood, but because he wasn't considered a serious suspect, he was never asked to provide a sample. The connection between Vernon and Thompson's Hardware should have been examined more closely. Who better to rob a store than someone who knew the layout? Who knew Bobby Ray's routines? Who knew when he'd be alone? Who knew where the cash was kept? Former employees should have been a primary focus, not a peripheral one. Evidence storage presented another challenge. Over 45 years, the police department moved locations twice. Evidence boxes were transferred, stored in varying conditions, and at one point nearly discarded during a cleaning initiative in 2003. Only the diligence of one detective, who insisted cold case evidence be preserved, saved the blood samples that would eventually solve the case. Leadership changes also impacted the investigation. Different chiefs brought different priorities. Some years, cold cases received attention and resources. Other years, they gathered dust, while current crimes took precedence. The Thompson family felt this inconsistency keenly. Some detectives returned their calls promptly and provided updates. Others seemed to view them as nuisances, families who couldn't accept that some cases simply don't get solved. "We were treated like we should just move on," David Thompson said in 2023. "Like my father's murder was an acceptable loss because enough time had passed. But it never stops being real for us. It never becomes history. It's always present tense. Who killed Dad? Why haven't they been caught? Those questions don't fade with time. They get louder." The controversies surrounding the investigation created friction in Pike County. Some residents believed police had done everything possible with available technology. Others felt the department had failed the Thompson family through incompetence or lack of commitment. That debate would rage for decades. Until March 2023, when the answer finally emerged. Vernon Dale Pritchett, born in Troy, Alabama in 1955, third-generation Pike County resident. By 2023, he was 68 years old, semi-retired, and one of the most familiar faces in town. He owned Pritchett's Lawn Care, a business he'd started in 1982. What began as a one-man operation with a used truck and second-hand equipment had grown into a modest success. 3 employees, contracts with the county courthouse, several churches, the Pioneer Museum, and dozens of private homes. Vernon's green truck with Pritchett's Lawn Care painted on the side was a common sight around Troy. He maintained the grounds at Troy Primitive Baptist Church, where he'd attended services for over 30 years. He volunteered with Habitat for Humanity, helping build homes for low-income families. His picture appeared in the Troy Messenger when he donated lawn care services for the Historical Society. He was married to Linda Pritchett, his high school girlfriend. They'd been together since 1974, married since 1976. 2 children, both adults living in other states. 3 grandchildren who visited during holidays. Neighbors described Vernon as quiet, reliable, and somewhat private. He wasn't the type to attend every community event or engage in lengthy conversations. But he waved from his driveway. He helped jumpstart dead batteries. He loaned tools. He was just part of the background of Troy, as unremarkable as the courthouse clock or the stoplight at Main and Elm. Nobody suspected Vernon Pritchett of anything more serious than occasionally parking his work trailer too close to the sidewalk. But beneath this carefully maintained surface, Vernon carried a secret that should have destroyed him. In the summer of 1977, he'd worked part-time at Thompson's Hardware. Bobby Ray had been good to him, flexible with scheduling, patient when he made mistakes, encouraging when he talked about his future plans. Bobby Ray had even written him a letter of recommendation when he applied to Blackwell Industries in early 1978. The letter praised Vernon's work ethic, reliability, and character. That letter helped Vernon get the job. 3 months later, Vernon would murder the man who wrote it. The cruel irony wasn't lost on investigators in 2023. Bobby Ray had helped Vernon, had trusted him, had vouched for his character. And Vernon had repaid that trust by crushing his skull with a blunt object and stealing whatever cash was in the register. How does someone do that and then live a normal life for 45 years? Dr. Elizabeth Chambers, a criminal psychologist who consulted on the case, explained, "Compartmentalization. Vernon likely convinced himself it wasn't personal. He needed money. Bobby Ray was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He probably minimized the violence in his own mind, focused on the circumstances that drove him to that moment, rather than the act itself. Over time, it becomes a memory he separated from his current identity. It's not that he forgot. It's that he built a wall between who he was that night and who he presented to the world every day after. For 45 years, Vernon walked the same streets Bobby Ray had walked. He shopped at the same stores. He attended vigils for Bobby Ray held at the courthouse square. There's a photograph from 1983 found in the Troy Messenger archives showing Vernon in the background of a 5-year anniversary memorial service. He'd been there, standing among people mourning the man he'd killed, listening to Dorothy Thompson speak about her husband, watching her cry, and he'd felt comfortable enough to attend publicly, to be photographed, to be part of the community's grief. That level of audacity, or perhaps delusion, is difficult to comprehend, but it speaks to how effectively Vernon had constructed his double life. He wasn't a nervous suspect looking over his shoulder. He was a community member participating in a tragic moment of collective mourning. Vernon maintained Dorothy Thompson's church lawn for years. Starting in the late 1980s, Pritchett's Lawn Care held the contract for Troy Primitive Baptist, where Dorothy attended services every Sunday. Vernon mowed the grass, trimmed the hedges, cleared the walkways. Dorothy would have walked past him, said hello, maybe thanked him for keeping the grounds nice, never knowing she was speaking to the man who'd made her a widow. If you're finding this as shocking as Pike County did when they learned the truth, make sure you're subscribed. Stories like this need to be told. These victims and their families deserve attention. Drop a comment. Has something like this ever happened in your community? When someone you knew turned out to be hiding something terrible? Now let's talk about how Vernon's carefully constructed life finally came crashing down. Before we continue, I need to pause for a second. If you're invested in this case, if you believe cold cases deserve more attention and resources, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who follows true crime. Your engagement genuinely matters because it pushes this story to more people, which means more awareness for these cases. And comment below. What cold case do you think deserves this kind of attention? What unsolved case keeps you up at night, wondering why it hasn't been solved? Every case represents a family waiting, a community traumatized, victims who deserve justice no matter how much time has passed. Now, back to 2021. Dorothy Thompson had been dead for 2 years. Vernon Pritchett was 66 years old, comfortably settled into semi-retirement. The case was as cold as it had ever been, but everything was about to change. In 2021, the Troy Police Department received a grant from the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, known as NAMUS. The funding was specifically designated for advanced DNA testing on unsolved cases. The Bobby Ray Thompson murder was selected as a priority. The case had preserved blood evidence. The victim's family was still actively seeking answers, and aging witnesses might not be available much longer. Detective Lisa Carmichael, who joined the force in 2018, took on the case as part of the cold case unit. She was 34 years old, young enough that the Bobby Ray Thompson murder was history to her, not a living memory. She'd grown up hearing about it, but only as local legend. Now, reading through decades of files, she saw something other investigators had missed: possibility. Forensic genetic genealogy had solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018. Carmichael explained in a 2023 interview. I'd been following these developments closely. Cases that had been cold for 40, 50 years were getting solved because of this technology. I knew if we had viable DNA, we might finally get answers. The question was whether the 1978 blood sample was still usable after 43 years. In July 2022, the preserved B-positive blood found near the back door of Thompson's Hardware was sent to Othram Inc., a private lab specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The process was painstakingly slow. First, technicians had to extract DNA from the degraded sample. Then they sequenced the entire genome, creating a comprehensive genetic profile. This alone took several months. In October 2022, Othram identified a third cousin match through GED Match, a public database where people voluntarily upload their DNA results from commercial ancestry tests. From that single connection, genealogists began building family trees. They used obituaries, census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property records, and any other public documents they could access. They worked backward through generations to find common ancestors. Then they worked forward, tracing down to individuals who would be the right age and location to be the unknown subject. It's like solving a massive puzzle where most of the pieces are missing, and you're creating them from scratch using historical documents. By February 2023, the family tree had narrowed to 3 potential candidates. All 3 had ties to Pike County. All 3 were the right age. All 3 could have been in Troy on June 14, 1978. Further research eliminated 2 individuals. One had been in military service overseas in 1978, confirmed through service records. Another had died in 1976, 2 years before the murder. The final name was Vernon Dale Pritchett. When Detective Carmichael saw that name in the case file from 1978, her hand started shaking. He'd been interviewed. He'd worked at Thompson's Hardware. He'd known Bobby Ray. He'd been right there in the original investigation, and he'd walked away. It was like being punched in the gut, Carmichael said. We had him. In 1978, we had him. He was interviewed. He was connected to the victim. He had opportunity and knowledge. But he was never seriously investigated because he seemed nice, I guess. Because his alibi wasn't verified. Because investigators were looking for someone more obviously suspicious. The genealogical match didn't prove guilt. It proved Vernon was related to the person whose blood was found at the crime scene. For an arrest and conviction, they needed direct DNA comparison. For 2 weeks, detectives conducted surveillance on Vernon Pritchett. They needed to collect a discarded DNA sample legally, something Vernon had abandoned in a public place where he had no expectation of privacy. On March 8, 2023, Vernon was observed eating lunch at Murphy's Diner downtown. He ordered the catfish special, drank sweet tea, made small talk with the waitress about the upcoming Pioneer Days festival. After he left, detectives entered the diner and retrieved his coffee cup and napkin from the trash. The items were sent for expedited DNA analysis. On March 15, 2023, the results came back. Direct match. The DNA from Vernon Pritchett's coffee cup matched the B-positive blood found at Bobby Ray Thompson's murder scene. The statistical probability of this being coincidental was 1 in 1.4 trillion. Vernon Dale Pritchett had murdered Bobby Ray Thompson 45 years ago, then lived quietly in the same community, maintaining his victim's widow's church lawn, passing her at the grocery store, attending community events, raising his family, building his business, all while carrying the secret of what he'd done. The arrest warrant was issued immediately. Planning began for an early morning tactical operation. because nobody knew how Vernon would react when confronted after 45 years. Would he go quietly? Would he run? Would he become violent? Nobody wanted to find out the hard way. March 16th, 2023, 6:15 a.m. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation Tactical Team surrounded Vernon Pritchett's modest brick ranch house on Maple Street, 6 blocks from where Bobby Ray Thompson had lived, 6 blocks from where the Thompson family had waited for answers since 1978. Detective Carmichael stood beside Troy Police Chief Daniel Morrison, arrest warrant in hand, as officers positioned themselves around the property. The sun was just beginning to rise. The neighborhood was quiet. Most people were still asleep. Officers knocked on the door. Hard, official, the kind of knock that means trouble. Vernon answered in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand. His hair was messy from sleep. He looked confused at the early morning visit. Annoyed, maybe, but not particularly concerned. "Vernon Dale Pritchett?" Chief Morrison asked. "Yes? What's this about?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Bobby Ray Thompson." Vernon's face went blank. The coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the porch. Inside the house, Linda Pritchett screamed. Officers placed Vernon in handcuffs and led him to an unmarked car. He didn't resist, didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead as his wife collapsed in the doorway, screaming his name. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They stood in their yards, watching in shock as Vernon Pritchett, the man who'd lived on Maple Street for decades, was driven away in police custody. By noon, Pike County was reeling. Social media exploded. Facebook groups dedicated to Troy news lit up with comments. People shared the story, tagged friends, posted shocked reactions. The Troy Messenger website crashed from traffic overload. Local news stations sent reporters to interview anyone who'd known Vernon, which was nearly everyone in town. "I've known Vernon for 30 years, said Pastor Thomas Reynolds of First Baptist Church. "He mowed our church lawn. He was at my daughter's wedding. He helped with the Christmas toy drive. This doesn't make any sense. There has to be a mistake." But there was no mistake. At 3 o'clock, Chief Morrison held a press conference at the Troy Police Department. Every major news outlet in Alabama was represented. National networks sent correspondents. The room was packed. "Today, we can announce that 45 years after the murder of Bobby Ray Thompson, we have made an arrest," Chief Morrison stated. Vernon Dale Pritchett has been charged with first-degree murder. DNA evidence recovered from the 1978 crime scene and matched through forensic genetic genealogy has identified Mr. Pritchett as the perpetrator. He explained the process: the grant funding, the advanced testing, the genealogical investigation, the coffee cup, the direct match. "This case has haunted our community since 1978, Morrison continued. "Today, we can finally tell the Thompson family that justice is coming. This arrest is a testament to persistent investigation, preserved evidence, and modern forensic technology." Jennifer Thompson Reese, Bobby Ray's granddaughter, released a statement that afternoon. "Our family has waited 45 years for this day. We're grateful to Detective Carmichael and everyone who never gave up on finding answers. We're grateful to the scientists who developed this technology. While it won't bring Granddaddy back, knowing who took him from us provides closure we never thought we'd have. We only wish Grandma Dorothy had lived to see this." The community's reaction was complex: relief that the case was finally solved, horror at who had been caught. Vernon Pritchett wasn't a stranger, wasn't a mysterious drifter who'd passed through town decades ago. He was one of them, a neighbor, a business owner, someone's husband, someone's father, someone's lawn care provider. People started questioning everything. Had they sensed something off about Vernon? Were there signs they'd missed? How many times had they stood next to him at the hardware store, the grocery store, church, completely unaware they were shoulder to shoulder with a killer? The most terrifying aspect is how ordinary he seemed, noted Dr. Elizabeth Chambers, the criminal psychologist who consulted on the case. We want to believe we can identify dangerous individuals, that they somehow look or act differently. Vernon Pritchett reminds us that the most effective predators are those who appear completely unremarkable. Vernon Pritchett pleaded not guilty at his arraignment. His court-appointed attorney, Marcus Webb, argued the DNA match proved only that Vernon had been at the hardware store at some point, not that he'd committed murder. "My client worked at Thompson's Hardware in 1977, Webb stated. Of course his DNA might be found there. He could have cut himself on the job a year before the murder. This doesn't prove he was present on June 14, 1978. But prosecutors had more than DNA. They'd interviewed Linda Pritchett, Vernon's wife of 47 years. In that conversation, facing the reality that her husband had been arrested for murder, Linda revealed something she'd kept buried for 45 years. On June 14, 1978, she had not stayed at her mother's house in Dothan as originally planned. She'd returned home earlier than expected, arriving around 8:30 in the evening. Vernon hadn't been there. When he'd arrived around 9:15, he'd been sweaty and agitated. His clothes were grass-stained. His hands were shaking. He'd told her he'd been working on their lawnmower behind the house and had cut his hand on a blade. She'd bandaged the wound on his palm, a deep cut that bled through the first bandage and required a second. She'd never questioned his explanation. Not really. Or maybe she had, but was too frightened to pursue it. Vernon had been volatile in those early years of their marriage, prone to anger, quick to raise his voice. She'd learned not to push, not to question, not to challenge. "Did you suspect he'd done something wrong that night?" the prosecutor asked during her interview. Linda had cried. "I didn't want to know. I knew he'd been desperate for money. We were behind on rent. His car was about to be repossessed. He'd been stressed and angry for weeks. When I heard about Mr. Thompson the next day, I wondered. But I told myself it couldn't be Vernon. I told myself he'd been home, working on the mower. I told myself the blood on his shirt was from the cut on his hand. I told myself these things for 45 years because the alternative was too horrible to accept." This testimony was devastating for the defense. Further investigation revealed Vernon's financial situation in June 1978 had been desperate. He owed money to multiple creditors. His car was facing repossession. He'd been working at Blackwell Industries for only 3 months, not long enough to save any cushion. The $283 taken from Thompson's Hardware, while seemingly small, would have provided temporary relief. Prosecutors theorized Vernon had planned the robbery. He'd known Bobby Ray's routines from his time working there. He'd known Bobby Ray would be alone around 7 o'clock when the last customers left. He'd known where the cash was kept, how much might be there, the best time to strike. He'd brought a weapon, a hammer or heavy wrench, something with weight. The kind of tool he'd have access to working at an industrial plant. He'd waited until Patricia Simmons left, until Bobby Ray was alone. Then he'd entered the store, probably greeting Bobby Ray like an old friend. Bobby Ray would have been glad to see him, asking how the new job was going, maybe offering advice or encouragement. Vernon had walked behind the counter, positioned himself behind Bobby Ray, and struck. The first blow stunned him. The subsequent blows killed him. Vernon had then opened the register, taken the cash, pried open the lockbox with a screwdriver, and grabbed Bobby Ray's wallet. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3. Then he'd fled out the back door, cutting his hand on something in the process, leaving those crucial drops of B-positive blood. He'd gone home, hidden the money, cleaned up, and waited for Linda to return. When she'd noticed the blood, he'd given her the lawnmower story. The next morning, when news of Bobby Ray's murder spread through Troy, Vernon had gone to work like normal, acted shocked when co-workers discussed it, expressed sympathy for Dorothy and the boys. And when police interviewed him 2 days later, he'd played the role of a concerned former employee, helpful but not suspiciously eager, sad but not devastated. He'd played that role perfectly for 45 years. Why did Vernon Pritchett murder Bobby Ray Thompson? The simple answer is money, but the full truth is probably more complex. In June 1978, Vernon was 23 years old, recently married, working an entry-level job at Blackwell Industries, living in a cheap apartment, driving a car that was about to be repossessed, behind on bills, feeling the pressure of adult responsibilities without the resources to meet them. Financial desperation makes people do things they might not otherwise consider. Not everyone, not even most people. But some people, when cornered, when seeing no legitimate way out, choose violence. Vernon knew Bobby Ray kept cash at the hardware store. He'd worked there. He'd seen Bobby Ray close out the register, count the money, put larger bills in the lockbox. On a busy day, there might be $500 or more. To someone making minimum wage at an industrial plant, that was a fortune. That was rent. That was car payments. That was breathing room. Prosecutors believe Vernon planned the robbery. The weapon suggests premeditation. The timing suggests knowledge of Bobby Ray's routine. The execution suggests Vernon had thought through how to get in, get the money, and get out. But did he plan to kill Bobby Ray? That's less clear. It's possible Vernon intended only to rob the store after Bobby Ray left. Maybe he misjudged the timing. Maybe Bobby Ray was still there when Vernon arrived, so he decided to wait. Maybe Bobby Ray recognized him, forcing Vernon to act. Or maybe Vernon had always planned to kill Bobby Ray to eliminate the witness. Maybe from the beginning, this was murder disguised as robbery. The defense argued Vernon had been desperate, yes, but not a killer. That the death was unplanned, a moment of panic when Bobby Ray turned around or reached for the phone. But the forensic evidence suggested otherwise. Multiple blows to the head, continued strikes after Bobby Ray fell. That's not panic. That's ensuring the victim doesn't survive to identify you. Vernon had worked for Bobby Ray. Bobby Ray had trusted him, helped him, written him a recommendation letter. That relationship should have made Bobby Ray the last person Vernon would hurt. Instead, it made him the perfect target, someone who wouldn't be suspicious if Vernon walked in, someone who would turn his back to help with something, someone whose routine and habits Vernon knew intimately. The betrayal is what makes this case particularly painful for those who knew Bobby Ray. He tried to help a young man get ahead in life. That young man thanked him by crushing his skull with a hammer. The arrest of Vernon Pritchett divided Pike County in ways the original murder never had. Some residents refused to believe it. Vernon had lived among them for 68 years. He'd never been in trouble, never showed signs of violence, never gave anyone reason to suspect he was capable of murder. "There's been a mistake," insisted Eleanor Wilkins, who'd lived across the street from Vernon for over 30 years. "I've watched Vernon mow his lawn every Saturday for 3 decades. He's helped my husband fix our car. He's babysat our grandchildren. You don't do those things if you're a monster." But others felt differently. Looking back through the lens of Vernon's guilt, some people remembered moments that now seemed significant. Small things, odd behaviors, comments that hadn't registered at the time but now felt ominous. "He never liked talking about the past," recalled Frank Dawson, who'd worked with Vernon at Blackwell Industries in the early 1980s. If someone brought up old times or asked about his life before, he'd change the subject. "I thought he was just private. Now I wonder if he was avoiding questions that might expose inconsistencies in his story." Several people remembered Vernon attending memorial vigils for Bobby Ray in the early years. He'd stood in the crowd, head bowed, while Dorothy Thompson spoke about her husband. At the time, it seemed like community support. Now it felt like twisted arrogance. The revelation that Vernon had maintained the lawn at Troy Primitive Baptist Church, where Dorothy attended services, hit particularly hard. For years, Dorothy had walked past the man who'd killed her husband, had thanked him for keeping the grounds nice, had smiled at him. Jennifer Thompson Reese spoke about this at a press conference. "It's a violation beyond words. Not just that he killed my grandfather, but that he inserted himself into Grandma's life afterward. He mowed her church lawn. He was at community events she attended. He lived here, comfortable and free, while she suffered for 45 years. That's evil." The Pritchett family became social pariahs overnight. Linda Pritchett, now 70 years old, faced hostility everywhere she went. People stared, whispered. Some directly confronted her, demanding to know if she'd known, if she'd helped cover it up, how she could have stayed married to a murderer. Her children, both in their 40s, faced similar treatment. Vernon's daughter lost her job after her employer decided her presence was disruptive to workplace morale. Vernon's son received death threats through social media. "I didn't know," Linda told reporters through tears outside the courthouse. "I suspected something was wrong that night in 1978, but I didn't know what. I was 23 years old, scared, and married to a man who had a temper. I made a choice to believe his explanation because confronting the alternative was too terrifying. I've lived with that choice for 45 years. I'll live with it for the rest of my life." Pike County's churches held prayer meetings trying to help the community process the shock. Town hall meetings were organized to discuss community safety, how to recognize warning signs, how to support the Thompson family. The case forced uncomfortable questions. How well do we know our neighbors? What masks do people wear? How many secrets hide behind familiar faces? The sense of safety Pike County had slowly rebuilt after 1978 shattered again. The trial was scheduled for September 2024. But given the overwhelming evidence, legal experts predicted a plea deal was likely. Vernon's attorney had little to work with. The DNA match was irrefutable. Linda's testimony was damning. The financial motive was clear. The connection to Bobby Ray established means and opportunity. As of the recording of this video, Vernon Dale Pritchett sits in Pike County Jail awaiting trial. He's 70 years old now. If convicted of first-degree murder, he'll die in prison. For the Thompson family, the arrest brings closure, but not comfort. "It doesn't bring Granddaddy back," Jennifer Thompson Reese said. "It doesn't give us back the 45 years Grandma Dorothy spent waiting for answers. It doesn't undo the pain and trauma this family has carried for generations. but it does give us truth, and truth matters. The case represents a triumph for forensic genetic genealogy. Technology that didn't exist when Bobby Ray was murdered has now solved his case. The preserved blood sample, carefully maintained through decades of storage challenges, became the key to justice delayed, but ultimately delivered. Detective Lisa Carmichael, who led the modern investigation, became an advocate for cold case funding and evidence preservation. Every piece of evidence collected, even when technology can't yet analyze it, represents potential future justice. Bobby Ray's case proves that. Departments need to invest in proper evidence storage, in cold case units, in new technology. These families deserve that investment. Pike County established the Bobby Ray Thompson Memorial Fund, providing grants for cold case investigations across Alabama. The fund has already helped solve 2 additional cases using advanced DNA testing. The case is now studied in criminal justice classrooms and referenced in forensic science textbooks. It's taught as an example of how modern technology can overcome investigative limitations of the past, and as a cautionary tale about thorough suspect investigation, regardless of how unlikely someone might seem. For Pike County, the resolution marks both an ending and a beginning. The ending of 45 years of uncertainty, the beginning of a long process of healing. Thompson's Hardware, the building where Bobby Ray died, now houses a non-profit organization supporting crime victims. Jennifer Thompson Reese serves on the board. She's ensured her grandfather's story is displayed on a memorial plaque by the front door. People need to remember, she explained, not just the tragedy, but the man. Bobby Ray Thompson was a father, a husband, a businessman, a coach, a teacher. He mattered. His life mattered. And the fact that it took 45 years to get justice doesn't diminish his value. Dorothy Thompson's wish, expressed to her son in her final words, has been fulfilled. They found out who killed Bobby Ray. She's buried beside him now in Oakwood Cemetery, her obituary updated to reflect that she was preceded in death by her beloved husband, Bobby Ray, whose murderer was finally brought to justice in 2023, 4 years after her passing. At her grave, visitors often leave flowers, small American flags, and handwritten notes thanking her for never giving up, for keeping the case alive through sheer determination. The September 2024 trial will bring the case to its legal conclusion. Vernon Pritchett will face Bobby Ray Thompson's family in court. He'll hear victim impact statements from Bobby Ray's children and grandchildren. He'll learn exactly what his actions 45 years ago have cost the people Bobby Ray left behind. Whether he'll finally admit his guilt, explain his actions, or apologize remains to be seen. Some perpetrators, when finally caught, feel relief at unburdening their secret. Others maintain innocence or silence until the end. Either way, justice has come to Pike County. This case proves something crucial. Cold cases can be solved, even after 45 years, even when the trail seems impossibly cold, even when technology didn't exist at the time of the crime. All it takes is preserved evidence, dedicated investigators, and modern science. But it also requires support, funding for cold case units, resources for advanced DNA testing, detectives who won't give up on cases just because years have passed. That's where your engagement actually matters. When cases like this get attention, when they're shared and discussed, it creates pressure for law enforcement agencies to dedicate resources to cold cases. It reminds prosecutors that these families are still waiting. It keeps victims from being forgotten. So if you believe cold cases deserve more attention, more resources, and more dedication, Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future cases. These stories need to be told. Hit the like button if you think the Thompson family's 45-year wait for justice was far too long, but worth the persistence. Share this video with someone who follows true crime, someone who appreciates stories about justice finally being served, someone who understands that victims matter no matter how much time has passed. And drop a comment below. What cold case do you think deserves this kind of attention? What unsolved case keeps you up at night? What family is still waiting for answers? Every unsolved case represents a family in limbo, a community traumatized, a victim whose story deserves resolution. Your comment might bring attention to a case that needs it. Bobby Ray Thompson's case is closed. Vernon Dale Pritchett's secret is exposed. Dorothy Thompson's vigil is over. And Pike County can finally begin the long process of healing from a wound that bled for 45 years. Justice delayed is painful, but justice denied is unbearable. In Bobby Ray Thompson's case, justice may have taken 45 years, but it finally arrived. And sometimes, in cold cases, that's all families can hope for. That eventually, someday, the truth will emerge from the darkness and bring the answers they've waited so long to hear.